The castle had not known flowers for 300 years. It rose from the Carpathian foothills like a wound in the earth, its black stone walls drinking the moonlight rather than reflecting it. The villagers in the valley below crossed themselves when they spoke of it, if they spoke of it at all. Most preferred silence. Silence was safer than naming the thing that lived within those walls, the thing that had ruled these lands since before their great-great-grandmothers were born. King Vladislav Constantine Dragomir had not chosen isolation. It had chosen him, the way grief chooses its hosts, settling into the marrow and refusing to leave. 3 centuries ago, he had buried his wife Elena in the garden she loved, beneath the roses she had planted with her own hands. The roses had died within a fortnight of her death. He had not replanted them. He had let the garden grow wild, then wither, then become nothing but stone and dust and the memory of color. He had not intended to become what the villagers whispered about, the monster, the shadow king, the thing that fed on blood and sorrow in equal measure. But time had a way of hardening even the softest heart, and 300 years was a very long time to carry the weight of loss alone. Tonight, as every night, he stood at the window of the great hall, watching the moon trace its silver path across the mountains. The castle was silent around him, its halls empty of servants, its rooms empty of life. He had dismissed the last of the human staff decades ago. Their heartbeats had become unbearable, a constant reminder of the pulse that no longer beat in his own chest, of the warmth he could never again share with the woman he had loved. He was so lost in his contemplation of the darkness that he almost missed the movement in the garden below. Almost. His eyes, sharper than any mortal's, caught the flicker of a lantern near the eastern wall. A figure moved among the dead brambles, small and purposeful, carrying what appeared to be a basket and a spade. He watched, motionless, as the intruder knelt in the dust where Elena's roses had once bloomed. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Vladislav felt something other than emptiness stir in his ancient heart. It was not anger, though perhaps it should have been. It was curiosity, as fragile and unexpected as the first green shoot breaking through frozen earth. He descended from the tower without sound, his footsteps leaving no echo in the abandoned corridors. The night air was cold when he emerged into the garden, but he did not feel it. He had not felt cold or heat or any physical sensation beyond the constant dull ache of loss for centuries. The intruder did not hear him approach. She was too focused on her work, her hands moving methodically through the soil, her lantern casting a golden circle of light in the darkness. She was young, perhaps 25 summers, with dark hair bound in a practical braid and dirt already staining her. A simple wool dress. Beside her lay a collection of small cloth bundles, each one containing, he realized with a start, bulbs and seeds and carefully wrapped root cuttings. She was planting flowers in his dead wife's garden. "You are trespassing." His voice, unused to speech after so many years of solitude, emerged as something between a whisper and a growl. The woman did not scream, as he had expected. She did not flee. She looked up at him, with eyes the color of autumn leaves, brown and gold and entirely unafraid, and she said simply, "I know." "Then why are you here?" She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron, considering him with a directness that no one had shown him in 300 years. "My grandmother was the castle gardener, before your queen died. She spoke of this garden until the day she passed, how beautiful it was, how the roses were unlike any others in the world. She made me promise that one day, when I was ready, I would come back and make it bloom again." Vladislav felt something crack within him, a fault line running through the glacier of his grief. "Your grandmother served here?" "Marta Novak. She was 12 years old when she left. She never forgot the kindness your queen showed her. Elena, his Elena, who had treated every servant like family, who had taught the gardener's daughter to read, who had pressed flowers into books and left them as gifts throughout the castle. Elena, who had been dead for 300 years and was still inspiring acts of beauty in her memory. "You should leave," he said, but his voice held no command in it, only weariness. "This place is not safe." The woman stood, brushing the soil from her skirts, and looked at him with those fearless autumn eyes. "I know what you are. My grandmother told me that too. She said you were a good man once, before the sorrow took you. She said if anyone ever made it to the garden and survived, it meant you were still capable of remembering goodness. Your grandmother was a foolish woman. My grandmother lived to 93 years and died in her sleep surrounded by her children and grandchildren. I do not think she was foolish. I think she was wise enough to see past the darkness to something worth saving." Vladislav stared at her, this impossible creature who had walked into his domain and spoken to him of goodness as if it were something he might still possess. He should kill her. It would be the merciful thing, quicker than allowing her to witness what he truly was. It would be the practical thing, removing the threat of exposure, of hunters, of the endless cycle of violence that followed when mortals learned monsters lived among them. But he found he could not move. He found he did not want to. "What is your name?" he asked finally. "Theodora Novak. Most call me Thea." "Theodora." He tasted the name like wine, like something almost remembered. "Gift of God." My mother had a sense of irony. I was born during a famine. She smiled just slightly, and the expression transformed her plain features into something approaching beauty. "Will you let me finish planting, or will you send me away? The sun will rise in 3 hours. Then I had better work quickly." She knelt again, returning to her task as if he were not standing over her, as if he were not a monster older than the castle itself. Vladislav watched her work in silence, watched her gentle hands pressing seeds into soil that had known nothing but death for 3 centuries. When she reached for a particularly large bulb, he found himself kneeling beside her. "That is an autumn crocus," he said quietly. Elena loved those. Theodora looked at him, and in her eyes he saw no fear, no judgment, only a soft understanding that made his ancient heart ache. "Show me where she planted them. I want to put them in the same place." He showed her. He showed her where Elena had planted the crocuses and the daffodils and the climbing roses that had covered the garden wall. He told her about the small fountain that had once stood in the center, now crumbled to rubble, and the stone bench where Elena had loved to sit and read in the afternoon light. He spoke more words in that single night than he had spoken in 100 years. When the eastern sky began to lighten, Theodora gathered her empty basket and her lantern and looked at the garden they had planted together. It was still barren, still waiting for spring, but there was something different about it now, something like hope buried beneath the surface. "I will come back," she said, "when the weather breaks, to tend what we've planted. The castle is dangerous. So is living in a world where beauty has been forgotten." She met his eyes one final time. "Good night, King Vladislav. I hope you find a way to rest." She was gone before he could respond, slipping through the garden gate and disappearing into the pre-dawn mist. Vladislav stood alone among the freshly turned earth, watching the place where she had been, feeling something stir in his chest that he had thought long dead. He did not sleep that day. He sat in his chambers as the sun traced its path across the sky, and for the first time in 300 years, he remembered what it felt like to wait for something. Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting the snow in patches that revealed the first green shoots of Theodora's plantings. She returned as promised, appearing at the garden gate each evening as the sun set, her basket filled with new offerings, seeds and cuttings, and small wrapped bundles of mystery. Vladislav found himself waiting for her. He would stand at the window of the great hall as the light faded, watching for the moment her figure appeared on the winding mountain path. When she arrived, he would descend to meet her, and together they would work in the garden until the moon was high. She was not afraid of silence. She did not fill every moment with nervous chatter, as the mortals he had known in the past so often did. She worked beside him with a quiet competence, her hands steady in the soil, her presence a warm constant in the cold garden. But when she did speak, her words were worth hearing. "Why do you stay here?" she asked one night, as they trained a young climbing rose to the repaired trellis. "You could go anywhere, live anywhere. Why this castle, these mountains? Elena is buried here, but she is not here, not really. The dead do not stay in their graves," my grandmother used to say. "They go where love calls them." Vladislav was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the rose canes. "I do not know where else I would go. I do not know who I would be, away from this place." Theodora looked at him with those autumn eyes that seemed to see everything he tried to hide. "Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps you could be someone new, someone who is more than his grief. You speak as if change were simple. I speak as if change were possible. There is a difference." She reached out then, something she had never done before, and laid her hand briefly over his. Her skin was warm against his cold flesh, a contact so gentle and so unexpected that it froze him in place. She pulled away almost immediately, returning to the roses, but something had shifted between them. Something had opened. "My father died when I was 12, she said quietly, not looking at him. "He was a woodcutter. A tree fell wrong and he was gone. My mother followed him within the year, grief and hard work taking her. I raised my younger siblings alone, 5 of them, until they were old enough to make their own way. I know something about carrying loss. It is not the same. No, you have carried yours far longer. But the weight is the same, I think. The way it settles into your bones and makes you forget there was ever a time before it." Vladislav looked at her, this mortal woman who had walked into his darkness and spoken to him of grief as if it were something they shared rather than something that separated them. How did you learn to live with it? I planted things. She smiled, that small, transforming smile. My grandmother taught me. She said grief was like winter, cold and necessary, but spring always came if you were patient enough to wait for it. She said the best thing you could do was plant something, give the earth a reason to wake up again. And did it help? The planting? Not at first. At first it felt pointless, cruel even, to put beauty into a world that had taken so much from me. But then the first seeds sprouted, and I realized that growing things do not care about our sorrow. They grow anyway. They reach for the light anyway. And somehow, watching them, I learned to do the same. The garden grew through the spring and into summer, a riot of color and life that seemed impossible in the shadow of the castle. Theodora came every evening, and every evening Vladislav met her at the gate. They worked side by side as the seasons turned, and slowly that neither of them noticed at first, something began to grow between them that was not a flower. It was on a warm June night, the garden heavy with the scent of roses, that Theodora finally asked the question he had been waiting for. Will you tell me about her, about Elena? They were sitting on the restored stone bench, the fountain murmuring softly beside them. Vladislav had commissioned its repair without quite knowing why, had paid the stonemasons in gold coins so old they had been puzzled by the currency. It had been worth it to see Theodora's face when she first heard the water sing. She was born in a village not far from here, he said quietly. Her father was a merchant, successful enough to give her an education unusual for women of that time. She spoke 4 languages. She could argue philosophy with scholars and win, but what I loved most about her was her kindness. She saw goodness in everyone, even in me. Even in you? I was not always as you see me now. I was human once, a prince, then a king. I ruled these lands fairly, I think, but I was still a man of my era, hard, quick to anger, certain of my own righteousness. He paused, the memories surfacing like bodies from deep water. Elena softened me. She taught me that strength did not require cruelty. That power was meaningless if not used to protect and nurture. She made me want to be better than I was. What happened to her? The question hung in the air between them, heavy as the rose-scented night. There was a plague, Vladislav said finally. It swept through the kingdom like wildfire. I did everything I could, emptied the treasury for physicians and medicine, quarantined the castle, prayed to gods I was not certain existed. None of it mattered. Elena fell ill on a Tuesday in autumn. She was dead by Sunday. I am sorry. I could have saved her. That is the cruelest part. The curse had already taken me by then, had made me what I am. I could have given her my blood, made her like me, granted her eternity. She refused. She said she would rather die human than live as a monster. Theodora was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. She did not think you were a monster. If she had, she would not have loved you. She feared what I might become, what eternity might make of me, and she was right to fear it. Look at what I am now, 300 years of solitude and blood and darkness. She saw this future and chose death rather than share it. Or perhaps she chose death because she could not bear to watch you suffer. Perhaps she knew that if she became like you, she would have to watch you carry the guilt of her transformation for eternity. Perhaps her choice was not rejection, but protection. Vladislav looked at her, this mortal woman who had spoken more truth in a single summer than he had heard in 3 centuries. You are very wise for one so young. I am not wise. I am merely alive, and I have learned that the living have a different perspective on death than the dead, or the undying. She reached out and took his hand, not briefly this time, but fully, her warm fingers intertwining with his cold ones. He should have pulled away. He should have fled to the shadows and the solitude that had been his only companions for so long. Instead, he held her hand and watched the moon rise over the garden his wife had planted and his strange new companion had restored. There is something you should know, he said quietly, about what I have done, what I am capable of. I know what vampires do to survive. Not just survival. I have killed Theodora, not only for blood but for anger, for grief, for the sheer crushing weight of centuries. I have done terrible things in the darkness of this castle, things that would horrify you if you knew. I know. He turned to look at her, startled. You know? The villagers tell stories. They say the mountain roads are haunted by those you have slain. They say the castle walls are stained with blood that no rain can wash away. They say you are a monster beyond redemption. And yet you come here, night after night, because the stories also say that you have not killed anyone in living memory. Because the stories say you protect the village from bandits and wolves and other darker things. Because my grandmother said you wept when your queen died, and she did not think monsters were capable of weeping. Your grandmother saw too much. My grandmother saw what was there to be seen: grief, loneliness, a man who had lost everything and did not know how to live without it. Vladislav was silent for a long time. The fountain sang its quiet song. The roses released their perfume into the night air. Somewhere in the mountains, a wolf howled, and another answered. "I am not a man," he said finally. "I have not been a man for a very long time." "You are not a monster either. You are something in between, something waiting to decide which it wants to become." The summer faded into autumn, and the garden began its slow retreat into dormancy. Theodora planted bulbs for spring, hundreds of them, as if she were making a promise to the future. Vladislav helped her, learning the names of flowers he had never bothered to know, feeling the cold earth between his fingers and remembering what it had been like to be connected to the world of growing things. It was on the night of the autumn equinox that everything changed. Theodora arrived at the garden gate as usual, but she was not alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, stood 3 figures in dark cloaks. Vladislav knew what they were before they stepped into the light. Hunters. He could smell the silver on them, the wolf's bane, the holy water. They carried weapons consecrated by priests and sharpened by hate. "I am sorry," Theodora whispered, and there were tears on her face. "They have my sister. They said they would kill her if I did not lead them to you." Vladislav felt the old rage rise within him, the darkness that 3 centuries of solitude had nurtured. He could kill these hunters. He could tear them apart before they had time to draw their weapons, paint the garden walls with their blood, and send a message to any who dared threaten what was his. But Theodora was looking at him with those autumn eyes, and he saw in them a question, a test, not of his power, but of his choice. "Let them come," he said quietly. The hunters stepped forward, spreading out to surround him. Their leader was a tall man, with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much death. He carried a crossbow loaded with a silver bolt, aimed directly at Vladislav's heart. 300 years you have haunted these mountains," the hunter said. 300 years of blood and terror. It ends tonight. I have not killed anyone in this valley for more than a century. The dead do not forgive on a timeline. You owe a debt that can only be paid in ash." Vladislav could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, all the lives he had taken, all the blood he had spilled. The hunter was not wrong. He had been a monster. He had done monstrous things. Perhaps this was justice finally catching up with him. "Wait." Theodora's voice cut through the tension like a blade of light. She stepped forward, placing herself between the crossbow and its target. "You promised me you would let me speak. You promised." The scarred hunter hesitated. Something passed between him and Theodora, some unspoken negotiation that Vladislav could not read. Finally, the hunter lowered his crossbow an inch. "Speak then, but it will change nothing." Theodora turned to face them all, her back to Vladislav, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. "I have spent 4 months in this garden, 4 months working beside this being you call a monster. I have heard his stories. I have seen his grief. I have watched him gentle with flowers he could crush without thinking. Patient with growth he will not live to see bloom. This is not the creature your fathers hunted. This is not the thing from the old stories. This is a man who has been alone with his sorrow for so long he forgot how to be anything else. Pretty words do not erase centuries of murder. No, they do not. Nothing can erase the past. But the question you must answer tonight is not what he was. It is what he might become. Kill him now, and you kill whatever chance he has for redemption. You kill the garden we have planted together. You kill the future for the sake of the past." The hunter's eyes moved from Theodora to Vladislav, assessing, calculating. "And what would you have us do? Let him continue? Let the monster live? Let me continue what I have started. Let me show him there is another way to exist. If I fail, if he returns to what he was, you will know, the villages will know, and you can return then with all the righteousness of executioners. But give him a chance. Give him a choice. Is that not what separates us? From the monsters? The capacity for mercy? The silence stretched long and terrible. Vladislav watched Theodora's straight spine, her steady hands, her absolute refusal to yield. She was magnificent. She was foolish. She was fighting for his soul as if it were something worth saving. "Your sister is in the village," the scarred hunter said finally. "Unharmed. We would not hurt a child to trap a monster, whatever you might think of us." Theodora's shoulders sagged with relief, but she did not move from her position. "You have 1 year," the hunter continued, his voice hard as iron. 1 year to prove this creature can be something other than what it is. If there is a single death in these mountains that bears his mark, we will return, and we will not stop at his destruction. The garden will burn, the castle will fall, nothing will remain but ash and memory." "Agreed." "Theodora," Vladislav began. "Agreed," she said again, more firmly. "Now go, leave us to our work." The hunters withdrew into the shadows, and the garden was quiet again, except for the wind in the dead leaves and the distant sound of water in the fountain. Theodora turned to face him, and her expression was fierce. "Do you understand what just happened? Do you understand what I have done? You saved my life, again. I bound us together. For a year at least, your fate and mine are linked. If you kill, I die. If you return to what you were, everything we have built here dies with you. Why would you do such a thing?" She stepped toward him, close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat, close enough that the warmth of her living body reached him like sunlight through clouds. "Because I believe you can be more than your past. Because I believe the man who plants flowers with me in the moonlight is more real than the monster from the stories. Because I have spent my whole life growing things, and I know that nothing worth having grows without risk. I could fail. The hunger is always there. The darkness is always there. I know, but so is the light. So is the garden, so am I." She took his hand again, her warm fingers curling around his cold ones, and led him back to the bench by the fountain. They sat together in the autumn darkness, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Vladislav said, "What you said to the hunters, about giving me a choice. No one has offered me a choice in 300 years. Then it is long overdue. I do not know if I can be what you believe I am, what you are asking of me. I am not asking you to be anything, I am asking you to try. That is all growth ever requires, the willingness to reach for the light, even when the darkness is easier." The year that followed was the strangest of Vladislav's eternal existence. Theodora came to the castle every evening, and every evening they worked together in the garden, or walked the moonlit grounds, or sat in the great hall while she read aloud from the books in his library, stories of adventure and love and redemption. She taught him to see the world through her eyes, through the eyes of one who treasured each day because she knew her days were numbered. She showed him the beauty in small things, the way light caught in a dewdrop, the first brave crocus pushing through late snow, the particular blue of the sky just before dawn. And slowly, so slowly he barely noticed it happening, Vladislav began to change. The hunger that had driven him for centuries quieted to a whisper. The rage that had sustained him through the lonely years softened into something more like sorrow, and then into something almost like peace. He learned to feel again, not just the cold ache of loss, but the warmth of connection, the joy of creation, the bittersweet pleasure of watching something beautiful grow. He told her everything, the whole long history of his existence, the wars he had fought and the loves he had lost, and the terrible things he had done in the name of survival. She listened without judgment, her autumn eyes steady on his face, and when he was finished, she said only, "Thank you for trusting me." She told him about her life in the village, her siblings scattered now to other towns and other futures, her small cottage with its garden that she tended alone. She told him about her grandmother's death, peaceful at the end but long in coming, and how she had promised to restore the castle garden as her final gift to the old woman who had given her so much. "She would be proud of you," Vladislav said one night as they watched the spring flowers begin to bloom. "She would be proud of what you have done here. She would be proud of us both." Theodora smiled her small, transforming smile. She always said that the best gardens were grown in partnership, that no one should have to cultivate beauty alone. As the year drew to its close, Vladislav found himself facing a choice he had not anticipated. The hunters would return soon, would see that he had kept his word, that the mountains had been peaceful for 12 months. They would release Theodora from her bond, and she would be free to return to her normal life, to find a human man and have human children and live a human span of years. The thought of losing her was more painful than anything he had experienced since Elena's death. "You have been quiet lately," Theodora said one evening as they pruned the roses that had grown wild in their second season. "What troubles you? The year is almost over. I know. When the hunters are satisfied, you will be free. You will not need to come here anymore." Theodora set down her pruning shears and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. "Is that what you want? For me to stop coming?" "No, but it is what would be best for you. You have given me a year of your life, a year you will never get back. You deserve the chance to live that life away from here, away from me." "And if I do not want to leave?" The question hung in the air, between them, heavy with implication. Vladislav felt his dead heart stutter in his chest. You cannot mean that. To stay here, with me, to bind yourself to this castle, to this existence. I have thought about it for months, what it would mean to walk away, to return to my cottage and my solitary garden and my ordinary life. And every time I imagine it, I feel like I am imagining a kind of death, a slow death perhaps, but a death nonetheless. You would live among the living. You would grow old. You would have everything I cannot give you. I would have loneliness. I would have the memory of this year, of you, of what we built together, and I would have to watch it fade while I pretend to be satisfied with less. She stepped toward him, her eyes fierce. I am not asking you to make me what you are. I am not asking for eternity. I am asking for whatever time we have, together, for as long as I live. I will watch you grow old. I will watch you die. And then I will be alone again, with 300 years of new grief to carry. Yes, and it will be worth it. Love is always worth it, even when it ends, especially when it ends. That is what makes it precious. She reached up and touched his face, her warm hand against his cold cheek, and Vladislav felt something break open inside him. Not the crack of grief this time, but the crack of something frozen finally beginning to thaw. I cannot promise you happiness, he said quietly. I cannot promise you safety or normalcy or any of the things a mortal life should contain. I do not want those things. I want this. I want the garden and the moonlight and the stories in the library. I want to fall asleep in your arms and wake to find you have watched over me all night. I want to grow old knowing that I am loved by someone who will remember me forever. You would have me remember you in grief? I would have you remember me in joy. The grief will come regardless. That is the price of love. But the joy is what makes the price worth paying. The hunters returned on the anniversary of their first visit, and they found Vladislav waiting for them in the garden. Theodora stood beside him, her hand in his, her chin raised in defiance. You have kept your word, the scarred hunter said, though there was no warmth in his voice. The mountains have been peaceful. The villages have been safe. They will continue to be safe, Vladislav said. I give you my word on that. The word of a monster. The word of a king. The word of a man who has been given something he thought lost forever. I will not throw it away. The hunter's eyes moved to Theodora, and something shifted in his expression. You choose to stay? I choose to stay. You understand what that means? You will live in shadow. You will be separated from your family, your village, your world. I understand. The hunter was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharply, and turned to his companions. It is done. We will not return unless there is cause. They left as quietly as they had come, and Vladislav and Theodora stood alone in the garden they had planted together. The roses were in full bloom, red and white, and a deep velvet purple that Elena had loved. The fountain sang its quiet song. The moon rose silver over the mountains. What happens now? Theodora asked. Now we tend our garden. Now we see what grows. He took her hand and led her to the stone bench by the fountain. They sat together as the night deepened around them, and for the first time in 300 years, Vladislav felt something that might have been peace settle into his ancient bones. In the months that followed, Theodora became something unprecedented in the history of the castle. She was not queen, for Vladislav had sworn never to take another wife. She was not servant or ward or prisoner. She was something new entirely, something that required a new word to describe. I think, Vladislav said one evening, as they sat in the great hall reviewing the estate's long-neglected accounts, that you should have a title, a role, something to explain your presence here to anyone who asks. What would you call me? I have been thinking about that. You advise me on matters I have long ignored, the village, the lands, the people who live in my shadow. You tend not just the garden, but everything that grows here. You are, in a very real sense, the one who keeps this place alive. He paused, considering. Royal advisor, that is what you are to me, my counsel in all things, my conscience when I have forgotten how to be good. Royal advisor to a vampire king, Theodora smiled. My grandmother would be horrified and delighted in equal measure. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She sent you to me when I needed you most. She sent me to plant flowers. Everything else was my own doing. Then I am grateful for your doing, more grateful than you know. She looked at him with those autumn eyes, and he saw in them everything he had thought lost forever. Not Elena, never Elena, that love was a closed book that he would carry in his heart for eternity, but something new, something equally precious, a second chance at connection, at meaning, at being more than his grief. Come, she said, rising and holding out her hand. The moonflowers are blooming tonight. We should go see them before dawn takes them away." They walked together through the garden that had once been dead and was now alive with color and scent and hope. The moonflowers had opened with the darkness, their white petals glowing silver in the moonlight, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness. Theodora knelt beside them, examining the blooms with the careful attention she gave to all growing things. "Do you know why I planted these?" she asked. "Tell me." "Because they bloom in the darkness, because they are most beautiful when the sun is gone and most people are sleeping. Because they prove that light is not the only kind of beauty, and day is not the only time for growing." Vladislav knelt beside her, his hand finding hers among the leaves. "You are very good at metaphors. I am very good at many things. Gardening, stubbornness, loving monsters who do not think they deserve to be loved. I am trying to deserve it. I know, that is why I stay." They remained there until the eastern sky began to lighten. Two figures in a garden that should not exist. A love that should not have been possible. When the first rays of sun touched the castle walls, Vladislav retreated to the shadows, and Theodora walked with him, her hand never leaving his. "Same time tonight?" she asked, as she always did. "Same time tonight," he replied, as he always would. The door closed behind them, and the garden settled into the quiet of morning. The flowers turned their faces to the sun, growing, reaching, becoming. And somewhere in the shadow of the castle, in a room where no light could enter, a vampire king who had known only grief for 3 centuries dreamed of roses and redemption, and the mortal woman who had taught him how to bloom again. The years passed, as years do, and Theodora grew old in the castle she had made her home. Her dark hair turned silver, then white. Lines appeared on her face, each one a record of laughter shared and sorrows weathered. But her eyes remained the same, those autumn eyes that had looked at a monster and seen a man worth saving. She continued to tend the garden until she could no longer kneel in the earth. Then she supervised from the stone bench, directing the young gardeners who came from the village to help. Villagers who had grown up on stories of the royal advisor and her vampire king and were no longer afraid. Vladislav watched her age with a grief that was different from what he had known before. Not the sharp agony of Elena's death, but a slow ache, a counting down of days, a treasuring of moments. He memorized every smile, every word, every gentle touch of her wrinkled hand on his unchanging face. "You are staring again," she said one evening, her voice grown thin with years. "I am remembering." "Remember this, then." She reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers trembling. "I have lived a good life, a strange life, and not the one I expected, but a good one. You gave me that. You gave yourself that. I only provided the garden. You provided the garden and the moonlight and the reason to stay." She smiled her small, transforming smile, weathered now, but still beautiful. "You provided love, Vladislav, the kind that lasts, the kind that makes even death feel like a small thing." She died in his arms on a spring night as the first roses of the season began to bloom. He carried her to the garden and buried her beside Elena, as she had asked, in the place where the moonflowers grew. He planted more flowers on her grave, species she had loved, species they had discovered together, species that would bloom year after year in memory of what they had shared. The hunters did not come. The villages remained safe. The castle stood silent under the moon, as it had for centuries. But the silence was different now. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of contemplation. The silence of a monster who had learned to be a man, grieving a loss that was also a gift. Vladislav tends the garden still. Every evening, as the sun sets over the mountains, he walks among the flowers that 2 women taught him to love. He speaks to them sometimes, to Elena and Theodora, telling them about the seasons and the village and the small joys that make eternity bearable. And sometimes, when the moonflowers bloom and the fountain sings its quiet song, he swears he can feel them there beside him. Not as ghosts, not as memories, but as something more lasting, as love that transcends death, as beauty that grows in darkness, as the eternal echo of 2 hearts that changed an immortal monster into something approaching a man. The castle is no longer a wound in the earth. It is a monument, a garden growing where nothing should grow, a testament to the strange and wonderful truth that compassion can reach even the darkest places, that redemption is possible for those willing to reach for the light. And in the village below, they no longer cross themselves when they speak of the castle. They tell a different story now, a story about a gardener who planted flowers for a vampire king's dead wife and taught him how to live again. They call it a fairy tale, but the best fairy tales are true.